and this is my Masterworks project. It's not a women's world. How colonization affected women's rights. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the fact that we live, learn, work, and play on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Squamish Nation. I know that we already mentioned that in the beginning of the day, but I felt it necessary to say, given the subject I would be talking about and the recent news from Kelowna. I've always been interested in history, but the older I got, the more I realized that history is not all sunshine and rainbows. When it came time to choose my Masterworks, I knew that I wanted to do something about history, but I didn't know exactly what. The more I learned about colonization, the more interested I became. I also knew how much of an impact colonization has made on the people that were colonized, especially on Indigenous people in Canada. I have also always been interested in women's rights because I've always wondered why men and women have historically and are still treated differently in our culture, but also throughout the world. I've also been interested in how we can reach an equitable society. Because of all of those reasons, I decided to research how colonization affected Indigenous women's rights. This was the perfect topic that combined all of my interests, and I knew that I would find it interesting the whole way through. Which, by the way, I really did. You can ask my classmates. I was always reading out interesting quotes or spouting off facts. I suppose we should get into the actual research part now. I hope you find it as interesting as I did. It's going to be annoying. Before we start this project, everyone needs to understand where the colonizers that I'll be discussing came from and why. As the population in Europe was booming, famine and disease was killing countless people. Everywhere was cramped, and they were quickly running out of resources, and if you weren't rich, life was downright nasty. Fishermen had to start going out further and further into the North Atlantic Ocean to feed the ever-growing population. They eventually went so far out they met the coast of North America, plentiful in fish, trees, and new land. In fact, there were so many fish that the boats were slowed in the water. More and more explorers made their way to North America, bringing back goods to try and show their respective countries that the new land had value. The Europeans came quickly in hopes of gold, land, and more resources. They expanded west with the help of the Indigenous people and came to the heavily wooded and lush land of BC. The British and many other countries had realized the worth of North America. The British claimed Canada and the US as their own, completely ignoring all of the Indigenous people that already lived there. They went up the coast to Haida Gwaii, one of the most resource-rich Indigenous groups in the region, and they started to trade with the Haida people. They were trading for furs. The Haida people had plenty of furs and the expertise to hunt otters and other animals much more successfully than the Europeans. The fur trade cemented the Europeans' relationship with the Haida. They knew that they were there, and they knew that they not only had lots of resources, but they had the expertise to know what to do with said resources. The Europeans didn't stop at the coast, however. They kept expanding, hoping to find more land, resources, and people, and they found it in Hawaii. Hawaii had lush forests, riches, and war. The chief of Oahu and the chief of Maui were in a vicious battle over control of the islands. The British gave weapons such as guns and cannons to the chief of Oahu, and when he won, they convinced him to do away with the old religion and government and to make Hawaii a kingdom. This proved to the British that they could colonize the Hawaiians relatively easily, making it an extremely valuable resource. There are many other reasons Europeans came to North America, but that's a very simplified telling of why North America was so important to the Europeans and why they had an interest in Haida Gwaii as well as Hawaii. To understand the rules and roles applied to Indigenous women after colonization, one must first understand the rules and roles that were applied to colonial women in European society. These roles that women were expected to fill were applied by the government, men, and society as a whole. I would like to state that most of the information in this section focuses on the American colonial women, as opposed to European colonial women, because they were the ones who most affected Indigenous women. In the United States, at a similar time to when Haida Gwaii and Hawaii were beginning to have more contact with Europeans, a white woman's freedom was entirely dependent on her marital status. Any unmarried woman or widows were called femme souls, meaning a woman alone. These single women could work any job that did not require a degree. They could buy and sell land, sue or be sued, write wills, and be legal guardians. Women in America could also now inherit money, along with any sons that were not born first. However, most women did get married. And while they still had legal rights, they were forced into total dependence on their husbands through the institution of marriage. Women were expected to give birth to an average of 8 to 12 children. They could not vote, own land while married, go to university, earn equal wages if their husband even allowed them to work, or report sexual assault or domestic abuse. Women were expected to cook, clean, tend the house and garden, educate and care for the children, care for their husbands, and, if they were of a higher status, manage the servants. Women were caregivers and were hardly ever allowed to do anything else. Women were essentially only independent when not married, and most unmarried women would be disgraced by their families or society as a whole. While there were certainly lots of hardships on colonial women, it didn't compare to the struggles of Indigenous women. The first group of Indigenous people that we're going to look at is the Haida people. Haida Gwaii is a group of small islands off the west coast of British Columbia, Canada. It is the ancestral home of the Haida people who've lived there for centuries. The Haida people were originally contacted by Juan Perez, a Spanish explorer famous for discovering the many islands in British Columbia in Canada, July 1774. Before colonization, Haida women and men were considered equals, with it being acceptable for the majority of tasks to be done by both genders. Women harvested plants, took care of children, participated in cultural ceremonies and wars, and much more. In fact, there are journal entries from early European fur traders describing how Haida women expressed their authority and power. The men would typically work on house and canoe building, pole carving, logging, hunting, and spiritual rituals. Despite this first contact, the islands were for the most part left alone until 1787, when the British Captain George Dixon established trade with the Haida people for sea otter pelts. Sea otter pelts were in demand due to the growing popularity of fur hats. It was easier for Europeans to trade with the Haida people, who already knew how to hunt otters, than it was for the Europeans to hunt otters themselves. This put the Haida people at the forefront of the fur trade, and forever changed the future of the Haida people. In the journals of British, Spanish, French, and American fur traders, there's a consensus that women had the authority when it came to trading. Here's an incredibly interesting quote from Joseph Ingraham, an American sailor and maritime fur trader from 1792. Here, in direct opposition to most other parts of the world, the women maintain a precedency to the men in every point, insomuch that a man dares not trade without the concurrence of his wife. Nay, I have often been witness to men being abused by their wives for parting with skins before their approbation was obtained. I hope it will never become general across the continent, as I am inclined to believe that even our ladies themselves will agree that female submission is most convenient. I think I lose more brain cells every time I read that quote. I can't believe he even actually wrote that. These men seem truly baffled by the fact that women had more power than men in determining the price of furs, and were frightened by the equality afforded to women in Haida culture. European men often refused to trade with Indigenous women because they only respected men and thought of women as lesser. What these men would be even more shocked by, however, was the thought of a woman in battle. The Haida people were a generally peaceful group, but there would come times when they had to fight, and when they did, women would be involved as much as men. If a European witnessed a woman fighting, they would find it quite strange, as in their culture, women would never fight. This occasionally gave the Haida people a leg up in battle, as when Europeans saw a group of women approaching, they would assume them to be peaceful and wouldn't be prepared. In his personal journal, Charles Bishop, a British fur trader and author, observed, "Seeing so many women about the ship, one would suppose nothing hostile was intended, but an American ship was attacked in these islands, where there were more women in the fray than men, and many of the natives of both sexes killed before they desisted." The Haida were a mostly peaceful group, and that is shown by their deep care for young children. Another highly important thing to the Haida was childcare, and it was something that everyone in the community would participate in. Many European fur traders noted that Haida parents were quite affectionate with their children, including Haida fathers. Here's a quote from George Dixon observing this. Chief Koya, his wife, their small child, and a number of women came out in a canoe to greet the ship. First, the chief came aboard while his wife held their child. When he returned to the canoes, she passed the child to him, not one of the other women, and went aboard by herself to inspect the ship. Childcare was a very important aspect of the Haida people's lives, but of course it wasn't the only important thing. As with most cultures, food was very important to the Haida people. I mean, they did have to eat. And while women played a big part in gathering the food, women would dig up root vegetables such as springbank clover, Pacific silverweed, northern rice fruit, and nuka lupine, plants similar in nutritional value to the potato. Women would also gather all types of seafood and would occasionally hunt. As you can tell, Haida women and colonial women had quite similar roles, but while colonial women would only do house and childcare, Haida women had many more roles, including lots of decision-making. One of the main ways colonizers, colonized Canada was through the Indian Act, something I'm sure many of you have heard of. I would like to state that in this section, I will be using the term Indian to refer to Indigenous people because it is a legal term. However, it is outdated and should only be used in a legal sense. The word was given to them by Christopher Columbus, one of the first colonizers to come to North America. He thought he had landed in India and therefore referred to the people there as Indians. Many Indigenous people do not like the name as it has been used in derogatory ways and aligns them more with their colonized past than their actual culture. The Indian Act was enacted in 1876 and is still in force to this day, though with many amendments. The federal Canadian government enacted the Indian Act, which had a serious impact on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and especially Indigenous women. Through the Indian Act, the federal government gave itself jurisdiction and control over Indians and land reserved for Indians. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, the Indian Act is the primary law the federal government uses to administer Indian status, local First Nations governments, and the management of reserved land. It also outlines government obligations to First Nations people. It is an evolving, paradoxical document that has enabled human rights violations, social and cultural disruption for generations of Indigenous people. Some of that trauma and human rights violations were residential schools, which separated children from their families and were one of the most hostile, traumatic, harmful, and tragic things that children have ever been subjected to. The Indian Act was created with the ultimate goal of assimilating or trying to get the Indigenous people into the European ideals of Canada. The Indian Act made it unnecessarily difficult for Indigenous people to obtain their Indian status, and that is still true to this day. Being a status Indian meant you could live on a reservation and participate in cultural ceremonies with other people who lived on the reserve. It was particularly hard for women to get their status, and once acquired, it was equally hard to keep. The status of an Indian was entirely based on males, so if an Indigenous woman married a white man, she would lose her status. This harsh truth is demonstrated by the excerpt. An Indian was a male Indian, the wife of a male Indian, or the child of a male Indian. Losing your status meant so much more than just moving away from your reserve and community. Countless Indigenous people had their families, friends, culture, and way of life taken away from them through the installation and enforcement of the Indian Act. Between 1958 and 1968, more than 100,000 women and children lost their Indian status due to the Indian Act. The Indian Act was an incredibly thorough act, and the goal of assimilation of the Indigenous people in Canada was sadly mostly achieved. The Indian Act, along with the viruses that Europeans brought over and many dangerous weapons, most of the Indigenous population, including entire groups, have died or they've completely lost contact with their culture. The Haida weren't the only group that this happened to. However, they were among hundreds. One of these groups was the Hawaiians. Have any of you ever been to Hawaii? Me too. In fact, it was the last place I went on the plane. Well, the last place I went to at all, I guess. It's pretty beautiful, right? The colonizers thought so too. The Hawaiian Islands are a group of islands located in the Pacific Ocean. The native Hawaiian people are descendants of the Polynesian people, and they have lived on the islands for thousands of years. The main islands we are going to be focusing on are Maui and Oahu. I would also like to say that each of the islands has their own unique culture, but they are quite similar and are consistently grouped as one indigenous group. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the native... Is that supposed to be? Yeah. Wait. No. Hold on. Sorry. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the native Hawaiian people had a highly organized governmental system with a cultivated language and religion that was staggeringly similar to the feudal hierarchy of Europe. This was called the kapu system, and it evolved with absolutely no outside contact for about 600 years. In kapu, many things were considered taboo, as that's what the word directly translates to. These taboo actions could include women eating specific foods, a commoner's shadow touching that of a chief, or other such things. The kapu system forbade women from eating certain foods such as pork, coconuts, bananas, and some other types of fish and seafood. Men and women had to eat separately, and men got the best tasting and most nutritious foods available. David Mallow, a Hawaiian politician and historian from the early 1800s, states that in ancient Hawaii, the husband was burdened and wearied with the preparation of 2 ovens of food, one for his wife and one for himself. This was necessary since men and women were not allowed to eat together. This shows that even before European contact, there was some gender inequality in ancient Hawaii, though not nearly as much as in Europe. Due to the fact that there were many islands, there were many different groups of people. In the 1790s, the chiefs of Oahu and Maui were in a hostile battle for control over the islands. Then, in 1810, using European weapons such as muskets and cannons, King Kamehameha I of Oahu took power of the Hawaiian Islands, establishing the Hawaiian monarchy. Up until 1838, the Kingdom of Hawaii was ruled very similarly to the ancient kapu system, keeping to the traditional ways of the first settlers of Hawaiian Islands. His son, King Kamehameha II, officially broke the kapu, and then later, in 1839, King Kamehameha III created the Declaration of Rights and officially departed from the traditional ways. King Kamehameha III changed the Hawaiian monarchy to much more closely resemble that of the English, showing the influence of the Europeans onto the native people. King Kamehameha III created the 1840 Constitution, which interestingly did not actually deny women the right to vote, because they used the gender-neutral term maka'aya to refer to the general population. Women were allowed to be in the House of Nobles, a group of wealthy and royal people who assisted the monarch. There would typically be 5 women and 10 men in the House of Nobles. Women were also allowed to vote for the House of Representatives, although they could not be in it. Later, in 1850, the women's right to vote was restricted. The new system was mostly harmful to women, but it did give them slightly more freedom when it came to religious-related things. The new monarchy gave indigenous women freedom to eat whatever and wherever they pleased, but they still could not vote or run for most high-ranking positions in the government, or work in many different fields, including any that required a degree. Colonization has harmed Indigenous people in Canada and the US. Their land and culture, including languages, dances, stories, traditions, and foods, were taken away from them, and they were forced to assimilate to the rules of a colonial society. Indigenous people have had to fight for the right to vote, work, live where they want, and nearly every other basic human right that everyone deserves. Colonization imposed a new religion in which they did not follow, and a legal system that was neither equal nor fair. Colonization has also negatively impacted the rights of Indigenous women, imposing the patriarchy, and it influenced the views of young Indigenous men and women towards sexism. In Haida Gwaii, many harsh laws were applied, and all respect for Haida women was destroyed. Men would only trade with men, despite women typically being in charge of trade, and women could no longer participate in many cultural and social practices, not to mention the land and the people that they lost through the Indian Act. In Hawaii, many similar things happened to the Hawaiian women's. Their jobs and freedom were stripped from them, as well as their respect. Colonization has massively affected Indigenous women, their rights, roles, and how we as a society view them. Due to colonization, Indigenous women could not, and in the present often cannot, feel safe, respected, valued, both in their own communities and around the world. This has been an enlightening project, and I feel like I've learned a lot. I've learned so much more about the colonization and the specific effect it had on women, as well as the history of racism and the patriarchy. I'm so grateful that I've been able to learn so much about Indigenous people and the way colonization affected them, because I've always felt like it should be taught much more in schools than it is. I'm so glad I've been able to do this project, and I've learned so much. I hope to use this knowledge to educate others and to further my allyship to Indigenous people. I now have a basic understanding of the history of colonization, and I will continue to learn more about this subject so that I may be the best ally I can. I would like to take some time to thank the many people who have helped me finish this project. I would like to thank Alexa McLaren, my external advisor, for providing me with endless comments and resources. And when I say endless, I mean it. On one submission, Alexa left over 100 comments. I always found them helpful, and I genuinely couldn't have done it without you. I'd also like to thank Carrie Marintet, my faculty advisor, for all of the last-minute meetings, advice, and motivation. I can't think of anyone who helped me more than you did, Gary. I also have to thank Jen Henriksen for all the help and the dozens of cups of tea. I don't think anyone in my class could have completed this project without Jen, especially me. I'd also like to thank my mom and the grade 9 class for always listening to my random facts and forcing me to do my submissions, because without them, I wouldn't have been able to finish this project. Thank you.
Congratulations. Nice to have that done. Good job. I just wanted to know if you could tell us what you learned that surprised you, because I'm sure you went into your research with a certain set of thoughts about what you find, and was there anything that surprised you?
I think the thing that surprised me most was probably how thorough the Indian Act is. Like, they really took into consideration every small little detail to attempt to separate Indigenous people from their traditions and from their culture. And I just didn't really know about that before I started the project, so, yeah.
Yes, it's an extremely interesting document. Yeah. Also, was there anything you learned that was different than what you thought you were going to find out? Like, for instance, when you were doing your research, you started with the idea that women who came from European culture would probably negatively affect the gender balance between men and women in First Nations culture. Was there anything that you found that was not in favor of what you had assumed?
Something that really surprised me was how much Hawaiian women were actually quite a symbol for suffragettes in America, so like feminists, because they had all this freedom, and a lot of American suffragettes used them as quite an example. So they were kind of like this huge image in the feminist movement, and I didn't know about that.
That's great. Good. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, Mr. MacDonald. I'm so proud of I had tears in my eyes, like I told you I would. This is a dense and heavy and important topic, and I'm just so impressed with the maturity and the thoughtfulness with which you confronted the topic and went through it. So, be really proud of yourself for that, and I'm really proud of you. I have one question for you. If someone wanted to learn more about this topic, where would you send them, or what resources might you recommend to them?
I would suggest Bob Joseph's book on, it's called 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act, and he also has another book on ways we can help and be allies to Indigenous people. We actually have a copy of it in the library, and it massively helped me with this project. It was a huge resource. Yeah.
Mr. MacDonald, wow, great job. I'm super impressed. And we've spent a year kind of dabbling in colonialism. Well, not dabbling, but learning about. Sorry for that. I'd like your opinion. You talked about colonialism as something that happened. We talked about it in school as something that happened. Obviously, we're still seeing the effects of it, but is it still going on? Is it still a thing? And what does that look like now?
Well, yes, it is definitely still around. As I said, the Indian Act does still exist. It has many amendments, but it is still in effect. So it's a lot less noticeable than it used to be, but there are a lot of things like how it's still very difficult for people, especially women, to get their Indian status. So that's one effect that's still around and happening.
Great. Thank you very much, and well done.
Thank you. I would also like to give a shout out to Adrian, because I did use quite a bit of things that I learned in INS for this project.
Great job, Mr. MacDonald. You should be really proud of yourself. My question is very similar to Adrian. You talked a lot about Indian status during the presentation. I was wondering if that is something that still exists, and if so, what it looks like today.
It does still exist. It's quite different from what it used to be, but it's more just like certain rights, like living on a reserve and other such things. You need to have status for to get, and it's quite hard to get your status still.
Is it still the same way that you obtain your status?
It's a bit different now, but it's pretty similar.
Good job, Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, what's your most important thing you've learned about this, or a takeaway?
I think my probably the most important thing I learned is that it's still very much happening. All colonization and the effects of what has happened is still very much a thing, and that's not really something you hear about much anymore. So I think that's the most important thing I learned.
Great job, Mr. MacDonald. Why did the root vegetables go out of fashion on Haida Gwaii?
Well, a lot of the land that they were traditionally harvested from was taken away because it wasn't on their reserve, so they couldn't harvest the foods. But also, when colonizers came, everyone was encouraged to grow the foods that the colonizers ate. So, and since potatoes were quite similar in nutritional value, that potatoes just kind of replaced those things, but they are still sometimes eaten in special cultural ceremonies and other things.
Mr. MacDonald, that was fantastic. You did an amazing job. So my question was, obviously this is a lot of really, really heavy information. So how is this research process being for you mentally? Because I wondered it would be hard to research.
Yeah, it has been pretty heavy, but a lot of it was just me finding like the funny, like the strangest things just absolutely hilarious. Like the things that the fur traders would say in their journals or other things. I just found them so bizarre that kind of made me like, I was like, what? Oh my God. So then that kind of encouraged me to keep researching.
Mr. MacDonald, excellent job. I was wondering if you could go back in time and tell one thing to the indigenous people and then slap one of the fur traders in the face for something they said, who would you choose?
I would probably tell the indigenous people, like, be aware of what's happening, because obviously there wasn't much they could do, but if they knew, then maybe there would have been a different outcome. And if I could slap one fur trader in the face, it would probably be John A. MacDonald, our former Prime Minister, because he said some things that I do not agree with.
You did a fantastic presentation and job, Mr. MacDonald. My question for you is, what was your least favorite part about researching this paper?
My least favorite part was actually when I was making these slides, when I had to put in some photos of the femme souls, or the independent women. All that came up when I looked it up was pictures of women's feet. So I really didn't like that.
Mr. MacDonald, thank you so much. I learned a ton today. It was really interesting and also sobering and hard to take. What do you think, what's the solution? I mean, it's been so many years, we're still finding out that colonialism exists. It's in our schools a little bit. What is your solution, or how can we improve on this?
I think that the best way we can improve is just continue with the reconciliation that we are doing, but to really, as a country, like, move a lot faster, because there is quite an extensive plan for how we can reconcile, but at the pace we're moving at, it won't be completed, well, till like 2060 or something, and that's just not fast enough. Like, that's just not okay. So I think that moving that along will be our best chance of that.
Thank you, Mr. MacDonald. I really, as everyone here has expressed, found your presentation to be so informative and timely, so thank you for that. I do have a question from Rosie's mom, Andrea Finch. Here we go. First, congratulations on tackling such a big, important, not fully understood topic. You've done a tremendous job. Question, were there any moments or facts that shocked you, made your hair stand on end, and that you think would shock others?
Things that really most shocked me were, I read a quote from John A. MacDonald, and this is why I would like to go back in time and slap him. But I can't quite remember what it said, but it was just so harsh and just inhumane that I was kind of like, I didn't know that humans could, like, think like that and do those actions. So that, yeah, kind of.
Perfect example, thank you. And then I have, I'm not sure if it's a question, but when the first slide that you put up and it showed the movement of the colonizers across, and there was Haida Gwaii and then there was Hawaii, and I couldn't help but notice that those both had similar spellings, like Gwaii and Hawaii. Did that stand out? Is there any connection between those two island populations?
There could be, like, there could have been some, like, very old trade that would happen, but I didn't find anything about that in my research.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I can't help myself. Mr. MacDonald, you are leaving. You have done your Masterworks. You've done a great job.
Thank you.
I need to ask you, after this presentation, will you come back and teach my class?
I would love to.
Good! We have that on record. Thank you!